This podcast is brought to you by Knowledge Wharton.
Joined by Bart van Ark, who's Senior Vice President and Chief Economist with the Conference Board. Thank you for your time today. And I guess let's start with the need that the Conference Board saw to do a conference like this, to start to really have a further discussion at looking 5 to 10 years out.
Yeah, well, thank you, Dan, for having us on the show. The reason why we did this conference really has to do with a survey that we do among the C-suite every year. We're in the 20th year right now on this, what we call C-suite Challenge Survey. And in the last year, we said, let's take a really long-term perspective. What do C-suite leaders have on their mind? But also, how do they think about their organization evolving towards the future? Everybody's talking about disruptive technologies, and we can't find the right skills, and there's all this competitiveness out there, and then the economy may drop off, and how are we going to deal with this? The question we wanted to ask them is, are you actually prepared for it? Do you feel that your organization is on the right track to be ready for the future in 2025? So that survey that we released earlier this year gave us a lot of interesting insights around the role of disruptive technology, the role of skills, issues around sustainability. How do business leaders think about balancing the short term versus the long term,
right,
and all sorts of things like that. And we said, you know what, we actually need to sit down with them and really have a conversation around it. So we put 11 panels together in a day and a half. We have 50 people on stage, and we do 40-minute blocks, very concentrated on one topic. And the real advantage of doing this is making the connection. We have the participants in the room talk to each other after every session, and then say, what did we pick up, and what does it mean for my function, and what does it mean for your function in the company? Because you have to approach this holistically as a company, and you can't do it by function by function.
Are there areas specifically that you're hearing from people at the conference that they see as being some of the most important areas that need to be focused on when you're thinking about 5 to 10 years out?
Yeah, so we started off actually with really talking about the big picture, what's happening in the world, both in the economy, but also politically and all the geopolitical uncertainties around. And I think, that makes you a little bit concerned, because there is a clear consensus that, look, uncertainty is something of all times, but there's really a lot of things coming together, and particularly for companies that operate globally. The world is less globalized in the sense that we'll get more sort of poles in the world economy that don't really coordinate that well as they did in the past. So it's hard for global companies to sort of, operate around these different parts of the world. And that's a big challenge for companies to prepare for, particularly if you are, globalized. I mean, we talked to one business leader who's operating in 169 economies around the world. And how are you going to deal with that? So I think that is a critical topic. How can you be global in a less globalized world?
And obviously one of the concerns that I think many companies have right now is because of some of the uncertainty, they're not sure how much or where to invest to improve their companies, to take that next step.
That's right. And I think one of the recommendations people said is that is a reality that is happening there. So we need to be more focused on what we're doing in those individual countries. We need to engage much more with the policymakers in those economies. We can't just approach this purely from a global perspective. So we have to be much more in the weeds in individual countries to work with policymakers, to understand the customer, to understand the dynamics of society and the cultural differences. And maybe there's a good thing to that too, that global companies do get deeper into understanding the countries they're operating in. So that's the big global topic. The other things that came up, of course, are issues around talent. This came back over and over again. Right now, we can't find the people because labor markets in most of the world are very tight. But even if that's not the case, because of all these disruptive technologies, we see the shift from emphasis on sort of very specified skills that people have in a specialized job to every occupation in a company require multiple skills, quite often a lot more softer skills to collaborate more across the company, and that's a big challenge for companies to do. There was a panel earlier today which was on technology, and there the comment was made that technologies make it hard really for companies to implement because jobs and occupations are changing so rapidly, and people have to change their competencies.
You mentioned something a second ago which has been talked about here in the United States, but I don't know if it's been discussed here more so on the global perspective, is that we see a tight labor market here in the U.S. Are we seeing that in other countries as well?
Oh, absolutely. Not everywhere, of course. This is a big world. But if you look at Europe, if you look at Japan, but even if you look at China, which is the biggest emerging market, obviously, you see this tightness in labor market. And some of that has to do with the state of the economy right now, which is, despite all the concerns that people may have around recessions, still economies are hanging in pretty well. But I think the more underlying topic is that we see this kind of slowdown in the long-term supply of labor because populations are aging in many economies. More people are retiring than new people coming into the workforce. And therefore, also the new skills that we need are actually fewer people who can really bring those to the table because these younger cohorts of the population coming into the job still need to acquire these skills in order to move the company forward.
Where does the data from the Conference Board take us in terms of this mindset of what employment is going to look like 5 years down the road because of the advent of more technology coming into being with companies? There's been quite a few suggestions that we're going to see the numbers of jobs available cut even more. But I've heard other people say that this technology is going to give us the opportunity to have brand new types of jobs. Yeah,
I think if there's one leading theme in this conference is that, yes, if you look at it at a sort of very aggregate level, then you would say, look, a lot of occupations are being under threat, if you like, or will be disappearing because of all this new technology and AI and robotics and everything coming in. But the consensus really is if you look a little deeper, you're going to look at the competencies that people need. And the point is really that the competencies need to change. Less functional, broader, more social skills and creative skills, as I mentioned earlier. A lot of the occupations that we have today are going to change into new occupations that will still be complementary to the new technology coming in. Yeah. So we've got to be careful with this fear factor. The fear factor is really about people need to be resilient and agile to make changes in their jobs and changes in their companies rather than worry about the fact that there will be no jobs left.
So what do you think then is the path that we need to take to be able to make some of these changes and make them effectively so that companies, to a degree, it's almost like a seamless transition going from one level to the next.
Yeah, so we had one panel on the topic of leadership development and how important leadership in the company is to make this transformation process. Because really, you have to break down the silos in companies. You have to create more project teams. You have to allow people to move from one project to another project and work with multiple people in the company. You have to incentivize them to do it, right? Quite often the performance reward systems don't reward people who sort of move across the company. Yeah. So even the way that we appreciate and award them for that role has to change. So leadership is actually a really, really important topic. And quite often, frankly, going back to the C-suite challenge, it starts in the C-suite. If they don't walk the talk in terms of thinking across the company, then it's going to be very difficult to get us.
But there's also an element of that leadership that is going to play out when you even come out of the C-suite and the mid-level manager, because you want those people to be leaders as well to be able to support that part of the organization.
Oh, absolutely. Actually, middle management is critical. And again, quite often the thinking is that, these new technologies may actually get rid of middle management because, we don't need it anymore. Those are, to a large extent, administrative management skills that can be taken away. Well, that's not quite the case because these people are actually really important to implement that change. And it's not just a one-off, that's the other thing. The word agility and resiliency come up over and over again, and people say, what does it exactly mean? Well, what it really means is that the change is going to be continuous. And because the change is going to be continuous, you need to be continuously prepared to make the changes.
Bart van Ark, who's Senior Vice President and Chief Economist with the Conference Board, joining us here on the show. I find it interesting when you look at the issue of climate change and you talk about sustainability, that there is probably right now a greater recognition of this as an element of what companies need to be looking at moving forward in order for them to have their success.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. There is an acceleration of the pace. As I said earlier, we do the C-suite challenge for almost 20 years now. And in previous years, it was like, it was sort of at the bottom of the list. It wasn't really all that important. We now see really a change of pace. We see companies say that actually sustainability is something that can help to create a competitive advantage. It is a key driver of revenue for the future. So I think and I think it really has to do with a couple of things. It has to do obviously with the regulatory environment that is going to respond to this. But I think it also has to do with the customer requirements and the customer needs and the awareness among customers that they want companies to really make a change and be serious about this. And the things that we hear are actually pretty dramatic in the way that companies try to make changes. And it's not easy, but it's definitely a change of pace. One example that I can give you, I work a lot at the conference board with CFOs in our member companies. Well, they weren't really so much on this topic. I mean, investors didn't really ask about it. Now, pretty much every CFO meeting that we have, sustainability is an important topic because it's a serious issue in order to report, in order to act on it as a company, and investors want to know what companies are doing.
Bart van Ark, who's Senior Vice President and Chief Economist with the Conference Board, joining us on the show. And not only does that play out in the role of the company and how it moves forward, but also the people, especially with publicly traded companies, the investors in those companies, they have an expectation of a lot of these elements in what they want their companies to take the path on as well.
Yeah, absolutely. The investors are putting up a lot of pressure here. In the past, obviously, Larry Fink at BlackRock has been talking about this for quite a while. Yeah. But now recently, we had the Business Roundtable governance issue around all these topics. And that really leads investors on these quarterly calls to ask for these kind of things. And the interesting thing about this is not a quarterly issue, right? I mean, this is, of course, really a long-term issue. So it is this whole sustainability issue is also changing the dynamic towards the importance of long-term thinking in companies.
So there's an element of this because of all these elements of play, going back to the role of the CEO for a second, that while the main mission of the CEO is still to factor in the success or find the success of the company, there are more and more elements that are at play that the CEO has to consider when thinking about that path of what the next 5 years is going to be.
Yeah, and we talked, for example, we had a panel here around the role of the board and how the board is going to begin to play in it, and how important the board is going to be, not just as an overseer and approving the budgets every year, but how the board is critical in the strategy. And that the strategy is not about the quarterly results, but really where the company is going to go in the longer term, and how important it is that CEOs and the board collaborate on this, and the board becomes a much more integral part of how of the direction of where the company is going to go. So
we're seeing more of a recognition by boards right now that this has to be a component, that relationship with the board and the CEO has to be even further intertwined than it has been in years past.
Yes, and I think absolutely. And I think what's going to be interesting, Dan, here is that between now and 2025, as you mentioned, I'm the chief economist. I do think we'll have an issue somewhere down the road. It may not be in the next few months. It may not even be in 2020. But it's hard to imagine that not before 2025 we're going to see some kind of economic crisis. The question then is whether boards and CEOs and leadership can move along with this, or whether they will drop back into their short-term cost-cutting and everything else. And so the real signal that came out of a lot of the discussion is, repair the roof and the sun is still shining. Make sure that you got your digital transformation done. Make sure that you have your talent in place so that when more difficult times come, you can really move forward. You have that agility and resilience that we were talking about before to deal with these.
What do you hope will be the benefit for the attendees here of being involved in a conference like this, and that they can take back with them to their companies to kind of take those next steps in being a future-ready organization?
I think that's a great question. I think the most important thing is that people need to be able to be out of the box. They need, and by out of the box, I in this case mean they need to think beyond their day job. They need to think about how do my actions in order to think about the longer term impact on other roles that we have as an organization. So you asked earlier about the middle management. Particularly middle management is important there to not just be focused on your business unit results, but also see what does this mean for the other business units in the organization. So what we did in this meeting is that we created a lot of opportunities, both through digital means as well as through conversations around the table, for people to really connect with other functions in the organization. organization and see how they can really build that collaborative culture that we think is critical for success for FutureReady.
How important then do you think this type of a conference will be in the future? I mean, thinking about, does this need to be the type of conference that is an annual conference now or a biannual conference because of how much change there is? I mentioned with Steve Odland, your CEO, before about the fact that we're in the midst of a revolution to a degree right now.
Yeah, right. Well, so I think we do hope that indeed this is something we can repeat. As I said, it's the first time we are attaching a conference to our survey. Yeah. So far, I would say it looks that this is really important for us to do, and the conference board can really play a big role because we're cutting across so many different roles that organizations and businesses have. Economy, finance, strategy, innovation, human capital, ESG, marketing and communication. So bringing all these roles together, we think is critical for the conference board. So yeah, we hope that we'll have a few more future-ready conferences to come.
Bart, thanks very much. Greatly appreciate it.
Welcome.
Thank you. Bart van Ark, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist with the Conference Board.
For more insight from Knowledge at Wharton, please visit knowledge.wharton.upenn.edu.